Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be reviewing the Kelloo Chelchele wash processed Ethiopia from Substance Cafe. And there's the bag right there. And Substance, based out of Paris, France. And this is their second ever appearance on this channel, having recently reviewed the Rungeto Kiongoi, a wash processed Kenyan coffee. And while I'm usually not the biggest fan of reviewing standard wash processed Ethiopian coffees, I did make it a point to pick up this one, as I really wanted to get a baseline for Substance's non-higher end offerings. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how this one turned out, as this right here is day 56. And recipe we opted for this coffee was the same as our previous Substance review, which was a 17:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which typically indicates a more medium fine grind. However, we went a little bit more fine on that grind as well. Now, roast profile for this coffee is also in line with our previous experience with this coffee roaster and the experiences we're going to have with the other coffees that we reviewed from them, which is to say that it's extremely light, one of the lighter roasted coffees that we've reviewed on this channel altogether. So I'd definitely describe this one as being extremely light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 30, first impression, and we did opt for the V60. And just like with the Kenyan coffee we'd reviewed from Substance, it did have a bit more intensity and sweetness than I might have expected for a coffee in this category. That's to say, a washed Ethiopian coffee that is this light, as it had the expected citric qualities to it, but also an interesting tropicality and a slightly spiced florality that felt somewhat reminiscent of anise. And I do know that this was a little bit of an anomaly. It's not something that I'd experience from this point going forward, so possible error on that first day. However, it was definitely quite prominent and defined from that first time trying it. In addition to that, a good level of brightness lending itself towards a pretty nice first impression. We move on to day 33 as we opted for the Chemex, and it was expectedly more toned down as there's less of the spiced quality from earlier and much more of a focus on the citric aspects. Still plenty of brightness and a higher than average intensity for a wash processed Ethiopian coffee. So once again, that's also in line with the earlier experiences we had from Substance's coffees altogether. So we move on to day 36 as we opted for the April brewer, and this is the first time the coffee had been a bit more in line with the expectations that we did have for a coffee in this profile, as it's clean and a bit more delicate while still offering a nice bit of intensity, just relatively less so than some of the earlier experiences. In addition to that, the focus does continue to remain on the citric qualities, so once again, just much more of what I was going to initially expect from a very light profiled washed Ethiopian coffee. We move on to day 39 as we opted for the V60 with the higher extraction adjustments. And once again, I noted this in our Substance Kiongoi review where I mentioned that I did not notice that Substance did actually have a brew guide. So I went into the direction that I normally would with a coffee like this. And it seemed to work out pretty well for us as it had the most intensity it had up to this point with a bit more definition to it as well, especially in terms of the citric fruit qualities to it. More of a stone fruit sense as well with a slight spice, but still pretty direct for the most part, so I was very happy with the way that this day turned out. Day 42 through the Chemex with Substance's recipe this time around, and the coffee was notably more toned down as I fully expected, truth be told. From the first impression with the Chemex, I definitely felt this wasn't necessarily the ideal brew method for this coffee because it already had enough delicacy and cleanliness to it that it didn't necessarily need any additional layering to that. This one offers a much more subtle presentation of the lemon quality with the brightness also a bit toned down and still notable within the finish. Lively, but still not necessarily the ideal brew method for this coffee, so I definitely felt like we needed to adjust from this point going forward. And on day 45, we opted for the V60 with Substance's recipe. And interestingly enough, I would say that this is one of the best experiences we had from any of Substance's coffees with their recipe, as it did perform pretty well in this brew method with a cleaner and more direct citric fruit presentation on a slightly sweeter side of things with what I would describe as being both a grapefruit and the listed lemon, mostly because there was a slight bit of a bitter quality to those citric components. Additionally, some slight mandarin, so even getting some sweeter citric qualities, a bit of green tea, and more of that peachiness. So a lot of experiences on this day specifically. We move on to day 48 as we opted for the Chemex with the higher extraction adjustments. And the coffee was nice, but once again, it did not necessarily feel like the ideal brew method for this one, as it's still a bit too delicate and tame, but exceptionally clean. So it continued to skew mostly in that citric direction, but outside of that, I wouldn't necessarily say that there was too much to be taken from these days. Day 51 final notes we have through the V60 with our higher extraction adjustments, and the coffee was the best that had been to this point. So I just honestly felt like this coffee was improving with time, and it did improve from this point going forward. This is the best day we've experienced of this coffee. A slight bit undefined off brew, and that's one of the more important takeaways I had from this day, but it cools off with some very nice depth and a slightly bitter citric quality once again, in line with what I had previously mentioned of the lemon and grapefruit qualities, but also some sweeter fruits. Once again, that mandarin, that stone fruit, more of the green tea quality, and some excellent clarity to it. They do have a passion fruit note listed on here, and I feel like we'll discuss that a little bit more when we get to the tasting wheel. So we will go ahead and put that up right now so you can see what we're getting. And we have a handful of level 4s, so we'll start with the cleanliness, level 4. And this time I can start with the cleanliness because in the same way that I discuss Kenyan coffees having the expected level 4 for finish and acidity, it's mostly expected that a washed Ethiopian coffee will minimum score that level 4 mark, and that was certainly the case with this one. Because once again, I really like the cleanliness and definition that Substance's coffees are presenting, and I think that has a lot to do with the profile that they go with. And once again, it's something that I probably want to discuss a little bit more when we kind of recap the Substance coffees that we did review. But I'm very happy with the cleanliness of this one because it's definitely true to that level 4 and on the cleaner side of that nonetheless. We move on to the finish level 4, and that's not necessarily always the case when it comes to wash processed Ethiopian coffees. Oftentimes they can be a little bit too subtle and tame, and I will say that when we did opt for the Chemex, I could probably justify it being at the level 3 mark, mostly because it did mostly offer a very subtle lemon-like quality to it, even with it being super clean and defined. It didn't necessarily have the most lasting finish to it, and that's why when we opted to go with this brew method, the V60, it definitely did yield significantly better results, kind of lingering in that sense, but mostly in that citric sense altogether. We move on to the acidity level 4. A little bit of a surprise to me. Even with the coffee being this slightly profiled, I wasn't necessarily sure that I would score and justify that level 4 mark, but it did for me. There was plenty of brightness, enough brightness to be on par with a lot of Kenyan coffees that we've also reviewed, so level 4 did feel justified with this one. We move on. Florality. Level 4, and I didn't mention the florality too much within this coffee, mostly because I wouldn't necessarily say that it was oftentimes the most defined quality in this one. It was a little bit more of that kind of generic white floral component that is present in the background, where the other fruit qualities, most notably the citric qualities, do take a, we'll say, lead within this one. So level 4 felt the best place to put that, even if it isn't necessarily quite as pronounced as the next thing we're discussing is that citric quality at that level 4 mark. I mentioned a handful of things: lemon, grapefruit, and the mandarin, so definitely getting a nice mix of slightly bitter and slightly sweet within that. So I did appreciate the way that the citric quality was presented within this one, given that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of citric coffees in general. We move on to the level 3s, and we'll start with probably the biggest one, the sweetness there at that level 3 mark. So even though this one had a slight bit more intensity and a slight bit more sweetness than the average wash processed Ethiopian coffee, I wouldn't say that it necessarily justified going above that level 3 mark because it kind of falls in that intermediate category. However, I've definitely had sweeter wash processed Ethiopian coffees this year, but I don't necessarily think that sweetness is the primary focus of Substance altogether. So it's not that I necessarily have an issue. Obviously, I would have liked it to score that level 4 mark, but I think the rest of the coffee is presented in such a nice sense that I'm fine with this one not necessarily reaching that mark. We move on, berry fruit level 4, and I alluded to it very slightly and very briefly when I mentioned that slight passion fruit-like quality. I can see a very slight tropical berry-like aspect that is within this one. Entirely could be the priming effect. However, I wouldn't necessarily say that it was on par with some of the other qualities that I did feel, most notably the other level 3 that is presented within this fruit quality, which is the stone fruit, as I would say there were more times I was experiencing a better defined peach component within this one. So definitely a nice mix of fruit qualities within it, all kind of skewing on that lighter fruit side of things. We move on to the savoriness level 3, and I feel like it's a little bit more of that kind of matcha-like savoriness. As I mentioned, this one was a bit more reminiscent of a green tea for me, which is a nice revelation given that I'm not the biggest tea person, so kind of having the differences in tea at times, a little bit more of black tea, and in this case a little bit more of a green tea, is a bit of a victory for me, given it's not my biggest and most well-known focus within coffee in general. And then the final thing worth discussing, the body at a level 2, and I don't think that's a surprise to anybody, as once again, this is a pretty light, well, it's a washed Ethiopian coffee, and that's fully expected it to have a lighter body to it in general. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. In the same way I discussed the Rongedo Kyonggoy, the washed Kenyan coffee from Substance, I feel like I really like the way that the cleanliness is presented within these coffees, as it allows for some really nice definition with the components that are present to it, most notably in this case the citric qualities, and I feel like that does make up for the fact that they aren't necessarily the sweetest coffees out there. But when I'm kind of comparing it alongside of that Kenyan coffee, I feel like this one was a little bit more consistent in the overall experiences, most notably with the V60, though at times I would say that the Kenyan had some slightly higher highs than this one, as this one I feel like had a ceiling that was a little lower than that Kenyan coffee, mostly because it is a wash processed Ethiopian coffee that does go against my own personal preferences, which usually skew a lot more on that stone fruit side of things. But even with that, I would say that it was my third favorite of the Substance coffees that we are discussing from them. So a lot of positives that I did take away from it. I would say definitely on the better end of the washed Ethiopian offerings that we've had this year as well. The type of person I would suggest this coffee to. In the same way that I started with the Kenyan coffee from Substance, I will go that same direction here, which is to say, start with the profile, very, very light. And I think that does help with the overall cleanliness of it, because this one was once again very, very clean. And as a result, you can experience a lot more of the brighter and citric qualities to it, as both of those were a little bit more prominent, defined, and pronounced than I might have expected going into this coffee. And I feel like if you like those aspects combined with a very nice level of cleanliness in a lighter profile, then this one right here is going to be an ideal fit for you. That's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Kelloo Chelchele, wash processed Ethiopia from Substance Cafe. Thank you for watching.